Look into his eyes. Now, I think you're going to see a guy who will go that inch with you.
Hell yeah.
You're going to see a guy who will sacrifice himself for this team because he knows when it comes down to it, you're going to do the same for him.
Hell yeah.
Right? That's a team, gentlemen.
Hell yeah.
And either we heal now as a team, or we will die as individuals.
It's time for part 2 of the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game Retrospective, where I am explaining not only what the game is and all of its history, but what makes it the greatest modern card game. In part 1 of this series, which I will link to on screen, I think it's up there, we talked about the theme of Middle-earth and how that helps make this game the great piece of art that it is. The art's also very good. Today's video, we're going to get into the cooperative aspect of the game and how it actually plays and how the way it executes on cooperative gameplay is part of what makes it the greatest modern card game. So let's name drop our weapons, get the hobbits out from behind the couch, and go win this game as a team.
You have my sword.
And you have my bow.
And my
Now this isn't going to be a how to play video, but I'm going to go over how it works, especially for those that have not played the game, so you understand a little bit of context here, because you might be coming to this video thinking, what is this game that is the greatest modern card game? Lord of the Rings: The Card Game can be played solo or cooperatively, and it can be played from 1 to 4 players. Some expansions can be played up to 8 players. The way it works is like this. You and your friends, and we'll imagine for this scenario you have 2 friends. I don't know if that's a good thing. You can't get all your friends to play. Say you have 3 friends. You're sitting all at the table. I'm gonna do my best, Tom Cruise Minority Report impression here. So you got right here, you got you, your buddy, and your pal. You each are gonna be working together, and you're each gonna bring a 50-card pre-constructed deck to the game. This deck is gonna be constructed with cards that thankfully you didn't have to buy with booster packs, but that's more of a topic for a later video in this series. You're gonna be going up against the quest, which there are many quests with the game. The core set comes with 3 quests. You're up against a quest. The quest has its own deck of cards, which is a mix of encounter sets that have been all shuffled together. The quest has the information of how you actually win the game. Have different stages represented by different cards, and that's up here. The encounter deck is going to be spitting out enemies into its play area, which is kind of the staging area of the game. Call it like, it's kind of like the mosh pit of the game. It's just where enemies are going up to get in the way of you making progress. Meanwhile, each player has their own play area. In addition to their 50 card decks, they will each come with usually 3 heroes that begin the game in play. These heroes are key to how the decks operate. A round of Lord of the Rings: The Card Game plays a little bit like this. Beginning of the round, the heroes in play for each of your friends will get 1 resource each. Each hero belongs to a sphere of influence, and almost every card belongs to a sphere of influence. So resources they get can pay for cards in their sphere. Once all the additions have been made to the proverbial fellowship, you and your friends will decide which of your characters are going to commit to the quest. They're going to be trying to go up and make progress on this quest. Once that decision's been made, because you don't know what you're up against yet, because once that decision has been made, the encounter deck is going to spit out 1 card per player. And they'll go into the staging area. There may be cards left in the staging area from previous rounds or from the scenario setup. Once it's done spitting out cards, and in some cases they'll spit out cards that will then lead to more cards being pulled out, things like that. If the willpower total is greater than the threat total, then you make progress. This is the main way you make progress in the game. After the result of the quest has been decided for this round, it's time to deal with kind of the spoils of what's going on the table. Players in the travel phase get to choose a location from the staging area and travel to it. What this means is they move it from the staging area and put it effectively as part of the main quest. Now that that's been dealt with, now you're going to deal with all these enemies. A lot of them are hanging out in the staging area, kind of looking at you ominously. They're just kind of off in the distance. They're just eyeballing you as you're trying to make progress on your quest. They're going to come and attack you. And before I explain that, let me talk a little bit more about the resources each player has to work with here. You have resources that can put on your hero. Each player also has a hand of cards. By default, you draw 1 card per turn, and each card that you can play has a cost associated with it. Those are the main resources you're using to play the game. But everyone also has a threat number. Represents Sauron kind of looking at you and paying attention to you. I don't know who else you'd be paying attention to. Maybe the guy's playing at the other end of the game store. The stronger heroes you start with, the higher starting threat your team will begin with. Every round, your threat will go up by 1 at the end of the round. And if your threat ever hits 50, it's game over. So your threat functions as a little bit of a timer. There are times when you can reduce your threat, and sometimes it'll get increased. For example, if you fail in a quest, everyone's threat gets increased. It also functions as effectively visibility, or how enticing you are to the enemies in the staging area. So what happens after the travel phase, you have the engagement phase, where first each player gets to choose one to engage, because sometimes you want to kind of game that a little bit and choose who you actually take off. You want to fight some enemies early to keep the staging area clear, because after all, the staging area is what's slowing down your questing progress. But then after everyone picks one, anyone else that is at the key number will see an enemy show up, and then you start the fight. Combat phase begins with, of course, because all these games work like this, you defend first. Any of those characters you committed to the quest are now exhausted, so they can't be used. They're just really tired. They're just like hanging out there saying like, you know, you do it. I can't, I'm too exhausted. When an enemy attacks, every attack gets another card dealt to it. It's called a shadow card. The majority of the cards in the game have shadow effects, and they're usually something like making the attack worse. After all the enemies have had their chance to have a swing at you, then you finally get to fight back. But again, if a character has defended, they are also exhausted. So only the characters you have left are ready to go. So the game is about risk management, fundamentally. You are deciding who to send to the quest without knowing how much you really need. You're making a judgment call there. And you're going to decide who's defending against incoming attacks without knowing what exactly you need. Only with what's left can you then make your board state better by actually attacking and getting rid of guys. So it's a risk management factor with many factors of variance in play. There is no scenario in the game where you can 100% guarantee that you will complete the quest, at least outside of maybe like the first quest out of the core set. This isn't really a simple game. You have your resources, you have your cards. You don't just play cards, you have to use resources to pay for cards, and you have the whole sphere match thing. You have randomness in the questing phase with the staging area and encounter cards. You have randomness with attacks and how enemies attack you. And you have obviously the randomness of your own card draw. There's a lot going on in the game and a lot of different levers that you can pull. You're constantly balancing, say, not having your heroes destroyed with risking having your threat increase, deciding whether or not to spend resources for cheap cards now or to save up for expensive cards later. There's a lot that you can do here. And it's in this interesting potpourri of complexity that the game shines as a cooperative experience. The way you measure how fun a game is partly measured by how great the game's best moments are. That will be, for a lot of games, deciding who wins a game. So if you play a multiplayer game, the moment where you find out who wins the game, whether by a flip of a card or by everyone revealing what they've kept to themselves while they built up a board state, or in some cases by just who's done the math correctly, it's the climax of the game. With a cooperative game, you experience that moment together. This climax of whether or not you all collectively win a cooperative game can be one of the greatest moments in board gaming. Now, cooperative gaming isn't for everybody. Some people prefer to play individual games, just like some people prefer to play individual sports. Winning as a team is different than winning as an individual. Even if it's not for everybody, compare, say, someone winning a golf tournament to a team winning the World Series.
The last 20 gives up 2 hits, and he picks up.
You don't have a dog pile when you win a golf tournament, at least not that I'm aware of. There's something to be said about winning a game where everybody on your team contributed. So a good cooperative game has the highest upside in terms of what that climax is like in a game. And if a game can reach that climax reliably, it's a very good game. Not all cooperative games do this successfully. You see, a lot of cooperative games fall victim to the quarterbacking problem. One player on the team knows the game much better than everyone else, knows what everyone else should be doing on their turn, and whether or not you win is coming down mostly to whether or not that player won, rather than everyone contributing something to the game. It's as if your quarterback were Peyton Manning and your wide receiver were some 12-year-old kid.
Suck.
I'll use an example. The most famous cooperative board game is Pandemic, and Pandemic is an excellent gateway game, and it's a very fun game to play if everyone at the table has a similar skill level and similar experience level within the game. However, Pandemic reaches a point where if you play the game 10 times, 20 times, you're not only going to know what to do in your turn, you pretty much know what everyone else should do. There's not any real hidden information in the game between the players. It's not so complex that you can't figure it out yourself. You can definitely play the app by yourself, for example, and have no problem at all. The players who are new to the game don't feel like they actually have anything to offer, and the players who are experienced are either not mentioning all of their good ideas, or they're gonna just be, telling you what to do. It's not a fun dynamic. So Pandemic is famous for suffering from the quarterback problem. In fact, that's why the first expansion for the game had the Bioterrorist expansion, is to give that really experienced player something else to do besides just tell everyone else how to make their turn. So a good cooperative board game, or card game, or sport, I guess for that matter, needs to address the quarterbacking problem in some way. Now, I'm no board game designer, but one of the simplest ways you can make a game impossible to quarterback is make it so complicated that no one person is realistically going to be able to juggle all the decisions you have to make in the game. That's not to say that all flavors of complexity are equal. What we're going to do here is we're going to compare two very good games and how they pull off their versions of solving the quarterback problem. We have the Lord of the Rings the card game. I would hope that was one of the examples here. And we're going to compare it also to Spirit Island. Spirit Island is a highly acclaimed board game, especially among board game enthusiasts. Spirit Island is a cooperative game that is a step up in complexity from Pandemic. Every player has a hand of cards, and the game has a lot more going on than in Pandemic. As a result, it solves the quarterbacking problem, at least for the most part. You have to really be playing with a mega expert in the game to have a quarterbacking problem with Spirit Island. Maybe not mega expert. To kind of explain how Lord of the Rings card game is different, I'm going to just make up a chart here. This is a chart where, for Pandemic, for example, the more experience you have with the game, the more your skill will go up. And you will, as your skill goes up, be able to effectively play for 1 or 2 or 3 players, etc. So what you want with a game is skill to matter. You want it to increase. You don't want the complexity to be so high that when you're new to the game that you just can't even do anything, that you just are terrible at it. You don't want that. To avoid quarterbacking, you want to make it so that experienced players aren't able to handle 2 or 3 or 4 different characters.
That's bad. Okay.
Now you see, this is the line for Pandemic. Spirit Island, by being a more complex game, lowers this line. When you're new to the game, you're not nearly as good. And even when you're experienced, you're not at the point where you can handle many, many players. The problem with Spirit Island is that when you are new, it is really hard. Like, Spirit Island, when you first start, it's a really hard game. Like, don't get me wrong. A lot of people might hear me say that and say, like, it's not that hard. Trust me. When you first start, it's hard. Good luck busting this out with quasi-casual board gamers. Good luck ever being asked to be the one to pick a game again. What the Lord of the Rings the card game does is, you see, it's complex, but it flattens the line a little bit. For newer players, it's not quite as bad as Spirit Island. And then for the more experienced players, their advantage over the newer players isn't as great. There is absolutely an advantage to being good at the game. It's kind of limitless how good you could get at this game if you keep learning it. Here's how it does this. Spirit Island, despite having your own hand of cards, is relatively deterministic. There's some randomness as you're playing this game in terms of what your adversary is going to do. So you're trying to keep settlers off of an island. Where they're going to show up is not determined, but there are only so many different options. You can kind of think ahead of what's going to happen within the round while you're playing it. You have your hand of cards, but everyone's kind of picking from the same deck of cards. There's really just a lot of actions you can do in your turn. That's where a lot of the complexity comes from. It's not all hidden information, it's partly hidden information. Where Lord of the Rings the card game gets its randomness, or gets its complexity, comes with the fact that not only there's a lot of hidden information, the enemy is less deterministic because the enemy has a much more interesting deck of cards to draw from. You'll have different styles of enemies pop up, different locations will pop up, treacheries. The mix could be anything. And this chance factor, this randomness, if you will, balances the playing field between the newer and more experienced players. An experienced player, they might make a decision that is the right one for 70% of the cards that might come out in the encounter deck in a round. And the newer player might make a decision that is better for the remaining 30% of the cards. That's not that much of an endorsement for the experienced player. The newer player has thought out their turn more than the experienced player. You're going to go with it, and you might end up being right. That's the main difference. A Spirit Island game, the experienced player will be right about what to do if they truly know what's going on, probably 90% of the time. The way the Lord of the Rings card game is able to pull off this level of randomness without being completely useless comes from all the different mini mechanics. So you have your own deck randomness, you have the randomness of the encounter deck, you have the randomness of shadow effects. You all know when those points of randomness are coming. It's not like you have randomness where your whole game comes down to one die roll, and if you roll a 6, you lose. That's not fun. You have multiple dice that are being effectively rolled with all these different decks of cards. and you're choosing which ones you want to mitigate. That's a bad analogy. You're spinning multiple plates of randomness trying to keep them all up. You don't just have one giant plate that just you're trying to spin. It uses randomness, and it uses it well. Because of that, the Lord of the Rings the card game makes those fun cooperative experiences happen much more often than games like Spirit Island, even than games like Pandemic. I remember the first time I ever played the Lord of the Rings the card game with friends. It was a 3-player game because these friends of mine were relatively limber when it came to playing games. We played Passes Through Mirkwood, which is kind of like the introductory quest of the game in the core set, and then we jumped right into Escape from Dol Guldur. For 3 players isn't as bad as it is for 1 or 2. And we beat the scenario, despite the fact that, again, these players had never played this game before. One of my friends, I realized at the end of the game, he was referring to Legolas as Nicholas for the entire time, because it was one of my heroes. He never actually read the card. He just thought we were saying Nicholas. For Spirit Island, I mean, I talked about not being allowed to bust out games again or select games again. It's kind of a running joke between my wife and I that I am never allowed to attempt to play Spirit Island again because it has always failed when getting friends, and again, even board game savvy friends, to play a cooperative game and have fun with it. The game often takes a very long time, cognitive load is too high, and we still lose. Kind of sucks. So that's when the Lord of the Rings card game is good, which for the majority of the scenarios, especially the later release scenarios, it's good. You get those cooperative moments. It's a great time. That's it for part 2 of the Lord of the Rings retrospective. In part 3, we're going to go back in time, specifically to 2011 when the game was released, and walk through how the game's card pool used for deck construction was amassed over the years. Remember to subscribe to Jack Sportfield's Game Room to see part 3 when it's released, and I'll see you in the next episode.